Every day, millions of people lift a cup to their lips, unaware they're holding a symbol older than most religions. It began as a cursed woman screaming into rivers and stone, not a logo. Tonight, we uncover how an ancient horror learned to smile back at us. You are not living in the most advanced age in human history. You are living in the most documented one. That difference matters more than people realize. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a light is on in a room that should be dark. A screen glows. A hand scrolls endlessly, not because there is anything left to see, but because stopping feels worse. The room is quiet, but not peaceful. Silence used to mean safety. Now it feels like something has gone wrong. This is how horror begins in the modern age, not with screams, but with routine. People once feared forests, oceans, and plague pits because they were unknown. Today, the unknown has been replaced by something more disturbing, the feeling that everything is known, cataloged, tracked, predicted, and yet nothing feels understood. We wake to alarms instead of sunlight. We drink substances designed to override exhaustion rather than respect it. We trade rest for productivity and call it ambition. And slowly, without ceremony, we normalize states of existence that previous generations would have described as punishment. Constant alertness, permanent anxiety, low-grade dread without a source. This is not an accident. In medieval Europe, bells rang to mark danger, prayer, or death. In the industrial age, whistles replaced them, calling bodies to factories instead of churches. Today, notifications perform the same function. Tiny digital bells, each one demanding attention, each one interrupting thought. Historians call this progress, but progress has always required sacrifice, and the dark truth is that sacrifice never stopped, it just became harder to see. In the past, suffering was public. Executions in squares, starvation in streets, disease announced by smell before sight. Horror was communal. Everyone knew where it lived. Modern horror is private. It sits alone with you at night. Dark history does not vanish. It changes clothes. When Europe built its asylums, they were called sanctuaries. When they became overcrowded, restraint became treatment. When restraint failed, silence was prescribed. Patients weren't healed, they were stored, out of sight, so society could function without guilt. Today, we no longer lock people in padded rooms. We give them deadlines, debt, metrics, performance reviews. We tell them exhaustion is normal, sadness is chemical, and meaning is optional. The architecture changed, the logic did not. In the 1700s, graveyards overflowed, so bones were stacked beneath cities. Paris still walks above millions of skulls. In London, burial pits collapsed into basements. The dead were not honored, they were managed. Now the dead are hidden digitally. Profiles remain active, messages linger, voices can be replayed. The past never decomposes properly. Grief never finishes its work. We are haunted not by ghosts, but by data that refuses to die. Every dark age has a technology it doesn't fully understand. Fire, iron, gunpowder, industry, electricity. Each one reshaped humanity before humanity could adapt. The mistake is thinking we learned our lesson.
We did not. We just became faster at denial. The medieval fear was damnation. The modern fear is irrelevance. People once begged gods not to forget them. Now we beg algorithms to notice us, to surface us, to rank us, to confirm that we exist at all. And when the system goes silent, when the views drop, the messages stop, the feed empties, something ancient stirs in the chest. The same terror peasants felt when bells stopped ringing during plague. Silence meant abandonment. Dark history teaches this over and over again. When systems grow larger than people, people become expendable. Empires collapsed because rulers stopped seeing faces and started seeing numbers. Grain shipments, tax ledgers, casualty counts. Today, dashboards have replaced scrolls. The abstraction is cleaner. The effect is the same. You are measurable now. Sleep cycles, productivity, attention span, emotional responses, even fear itself is quantified, packaged, sold back to you as content. And that is the final evolution of horror. It no longer hides in the dark. It monetizes it. True crime becomes entertainment. Atrocities become thumbnails. Tragedy is optimized for engagement. The suffering of the past is replayed endlessly, stripped of context, until empathy dulls and horror becomes aesthetic. We do not remember history to prevent it anymore. We consume it to feel something. And that hunger to feel anything at all is not new. It echoes the hunger that built execution scaffolds, freak shows, human zoos, public dissections. The only difference is that now you can witness everything without leaving your chair, without smelling the blood, without touching consequence. Distance has made us brave and numb. But history has a habit of circling back. Every civilization that believed itself too advanced for collapse learned the same lesson too late. Progress does not erase human nature. It amplifies it. The fear hasn't gone away. It has just learned to whisper through glass and wire. And somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the scrolling, the caffeine, the constant light, something very old is still watching, still waiting, still patient. Because horror doesn't need claws anymore. It has schedules.
The fear deepens when you realize that nothing in this world truly turns off anymore. Night used to mean rest. Darkness used to mean safety. Civilizations were structured around the assumption that the human body would eventually collapse into sleep, that thought would loosen its grip, that consciousness would retreat. Night was a boundary. Even terror respected it. Now, night is optional. Cities glow like open wounds visible from space. Offices never fully close. Messages arrive at hours that once belonged only to dreams. There is no longer a natural stopping point, only exhaustion pretending to be rest. And exhaustion throughout history has always been a tool. In ancient armies, sleep deprivation was a weapon. Prisoners were kept awake until their sense of self dissolved. Confessions followed. Compliance followed. The mind, stripped of rest, becomes pliable. We rediscovered this accidentally and then kept going. Modern life does not beat people into submission. It wears them down, slowly, politely, with incentives. You are not forced to stay awake. You are invited to. Another episode, one more scroll, a notification that arrives just as your eyes close. The body learns that rest is unsafe, that vigilance must continue, because something might be missed. And missing something now feels like death.
Historians used to study how medieval peasants lived under constant threat, famine, war, disease, and wondered how they survived psychologically. The answer was simple. Fear had limits. It came in waves. There were quiet seasons. We removed the seasons. Fear is now ambient. You don't feel it sharply the way people once felt the approach of soldiers or plague carts. Instead, it hums, a background vibration beneath daily life. Financial dread, social dread, existential dread, a constant awareness that everything is fragile and replaceable, including you. In the past, execution was a spectacle meant to remind the crowd of authority. Today, authority rarely needs spectacle. It uses precarity, the fear of falling behind, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that rest itself is a luxury you haven't earned. This is how dark systems mature. They stop needing visible cruelty. They let people police themselves. Look back far enough and you'll see the pattern repeating. Roman citizens distracted with games while their empire hollowed out. Industrial workers pacified with wages just sufficient to survive. Modern populations anesthetized with content, outrage cycles, and endless stimulation. Every age believes it is choosing freely. Every age is wrong. The archives tell us something else too, something uncomfortable. Societies do not collapse when people are afraid. They collapse when people are tired. Tired people do not revolt. Tired people do not imagine alternatives. Tired people cling to familiarity, even when it hurts them. And so the systems persist. In old Europe, bells once marked the hours so people knew when to work and when to pray. Later, factory whistles replaced them. Today, the bell lives in your pocket. You flinch at its sound even when it's not there. Phantom vibrations, ghost notifications. A haunted object, by definition, is something that continues to act even when no one is touching it. Modern devices qualify. The past believed ghosts were the dead who refused to leave. The present is haunted by the living who cannot disconnect. We carry our labor with us into bed, our identities into sleep, our anxieties into dreams that feel more like unfinished tasks than visions. The mind never fully shuts down, and neither does history. Because history is not behind us, it's embedded. The bones beneath Paris were not removed, they were hidden. The trauma of wars was not resolved, it was inherited. The logic of exploitation was not dismantled, it was optimized. Each generation inherits a cleaner version of the same machinery and mistakes the absence of blood for the absence of violence. But the body knows. The rise in anxiety, insomnia, dissociation, these are not personal failures, they are historical symptoms, echoes of old systems expressed through new forms. When people in the past lived under unbearable pressure, they spoke of curses, demons, divine punishment. We speak of burnout. Different language, same damage. And just as medieval societies created monsters to explain their suffering, modern society creates narratives to avoid responsibility. Self-help instead of structural change, positivity instead of justice, productivity instead of rest. Horror has always thrived where truth is inconvenient. The final cruelty of modernity is that it convinces people their pain is individual, not historical, that they are broken, not the system that shaped them. This isolation makes suffering quieter and therefore easier to ignore. Inquisition chambers were loud. This is worse. because no one hears the screams when they happen silently, behind screens, in bedrooms lit only by a phone's pale glow at 2:47 a.m. Dark history never warns us directly. It leaves patterns. It waits to see if we notice. And the pattern unfolding now is familiar to anyone who studies the past. A civilization that has mastered comfort but forgotten care, that can simulate meaning but struggles to create it, that records everything but understands almost nothing. The question history always asks at this stage is simple. Not, will this end, because everything ends, but what will people call it when it does?
The next phase of the story begins quietly, the way all effective systems do. No announcement, no declaration, just convenience. Surveillance in earlier centuries was blunt. Guards on towers, informants in taverns, spies who smelled of fear and desperation. People knew when they were being watched, and that knowledge shaped behavior through intimidation. Modern surveillance learned something better. It learned to feel helpful. Cameras appeared first as protection, data collection as personalization, tracking as optimization, each step framed as comfort, safety, efficiency. And like every dark structure in history, it did not arrive fully formed. It evolved alongside acceptance. In the past, rulers demanded loyalty. Today, systems reward compliance. You are not punished for deviating. You are simply deprioritized. Less visibility, fewer opportunities, reduced reach. The punishment is absence. This is a very old tactic. During famines, grain was not taken from dissenters. It was simply delayed. During plagues, neighborhoods were not attacked. They were sealed and forgotten. Power learned long ago that silence is more effective than force. And now, silence is automated. Your habits are recorded not because you are important, but because patterns are. You exist as a cluster of probabilities. The system does not care who you are. It cares what you are likely to do next. And when you behave unexpectedly, that is when attention sharpens. This is where the horror becomes subtle. In medieval times, people feared being judged by God. Today, people fear being judged by metrics they cannot see. Engagement scores, risk profiles, invisible thresholds that determine whether doors open smoothly or never quite open at all. The terror is not persecution. The terror is unknowability. Dark history shows us what happens when societies normalize being watched. Self-censorship follows, then self-erasure. People stop expressing what they think and begin expressing what performs well. Identity becomes adaptive camouflage. This is not new. Court politics functioned the same way, so did totalitarian regimes, but never before has the pressure been so constant, so personalized, so intimate. The watchtower now fits in your palm. And still, people comply willingly because the system feeds something ancient, the desire to belong, to be seen, to matter. Humans have always traded freedom for security. The only change is the currency. Rituals used to be obvious: church on Sundays, market days, feast days, mourning periods. Modern rituals are disguised as habits: morning scrolling, nightly checking, the compulsion to document experiences instead of inhabiting them. Anthropologists would recognize these immediately if they stepped back far enough. They are appeasement behaviors, offerings made to unseen powers in exchange for reassurance. Post, react, update, repeat. And like all rituals, they shape belief.
People begin to believe that visibility equals existence, that silence equals disappearance, that rest is indulgence, that productivity is virtue. These beliefs are not taught explicitly, they are absorbed through repetition, just as religious doctrine once was. The difference is that gods demanded faith, systems demand participation. Dark history teaches us that when belief systems become compulsory, they stop being spiritual and start being coercive. Medieval heresy trials were not about belief, they were about control. Deviance threatened cohesion. Today, opting out threatens data integrity. Those who disconnect are not burned at stakes, they are quietly excluded. They miss updates, invitations, opportunities. Their absence becomes suspicious, then inconvenient, then invisible. And invisibility for a social species is a slow death. The future is often imagined as cold and mechanical, but if history is a guide, it will be warm, familiar, and exhausting. People will not be ruled by machines, but by systems designed by humans who stopped thinking of other humans as people. This is how cruelty scales, not through hatred, but through abstraction. In old records, you'll find letters from bureaucrats during famines calmly discussing starvation as logistics. In war archives, casualty numbers replace names. Today, burnout statistics replace stories. Mental health becomes a chart. Trauma becomes a trend. The suffering is real. The language numbs it. And this is the final inheritance of dark history. When horror becomes normalized, it stops shocking. It simply persists. People once asked, how could they let that happen about past atrocities? The answer was never ignorance. It was gradualism. Small compromises, reasonable steps, temporary measures that became permanent. No one wakes up inside a nightmare. They walk into it slowly, while adjusting. And that is where we are now, not at the end, but in the middle. A point history recognizes well. A point where people sense something is wrong, but cannot agree on what. Where fear exists without a face, and exhaustion replaces outrage. This is the most dangerous moment any civilization reaches, because the monsters no longer look like monsters, they look like schedules, interfaces, policies, terms you agree to without reading.
There is a moment in every dark age when people stop asking how things work and start asking how to survive within them. That moment is quiet. It does not come with riots or declarations. It arrives when people learn which thoughts are safe to voice, which emotions must be hidden, which truths are better softened into jokes or silence. It arrives when adaptation feels wiser than resistance. History recognizes this moment clearly. It happened when medieval towns learned which families to avoid during plague outbreaks, when neighbors quietly stopped helping the sick because mercy had become dangerous. It happened when citizens of collapsing empires learned to flatter the right officials, memorize the right slogans, pretend not to notice disappearances. It is happening again, but without uniforms, without borders, without a single ruler to point at. Now it happens inside the mind. People curate themselves the way past societies curated public morality. They learn what version of themselves performs best, which opinions generate approval, which questions cause friction. Slowly, identity becomes strategic, authenticity becomes risky. This is not paranoia, it is historical pattern. Every system that grows large enough eventually prioritizes predictability over humanity.
Unpredictable people slow things down. They ask inconvenient questions. They disrupt flow. And so systems gently discourage unpredictability until conformity feels like common sense. In medieval monasteries, monks copied texts not to preserve truth, but to preserve order. Dangerous ideas were not burned immediately, they were simply not reproduced. Silence erased more effectively than fire. Modern systems operate the same way. What is not amplified fades. What fades is forgotten. What is forgotten might as well have never existed. And yet, humans have always tried to cheat death by leaving traces. Cave paintings, letters, diaries, grave markers. Each generation believed that memory could outlast flesh, that if they recorded themselves carefully enough, they would remain. Now, memory is effortless, and that is the problem. When everything is saved, nothing is sacred. When every moment is documented, meaning thins. The archive grows so vast it becomes unusable. History is no longer curated by scholars. It is flattened into feeds where tragedy and triviality sit side by side, indistinguishable in weight. The future will not struggle to find records of us. It will struggle to understand us. Dark ages are often misunderstood as times of ignorance. In truth, they are times of overload, too many crises, too many contradictions, too much strain for existing structures to hold. Knowledge does not vanish, context does. We are entering that phase now. Digital afterlives already exist. Accounts remain active after death. Voices can be synthesized, faces reconstructed. People speak to the dead through archived messages, preserved like relics. Grief no longer ends, it loops. In earlier centuries, mourning rituals helped the living accept loss. Today, loss is deferred indefinitely. The dead linger as data shadows, never fully gone, never fully present. This creates a new kind of haunting. Not spirits trapped between worlds, but identities trapped between servers. History warns us about this too. When ancestors were believed to linger too long, cultures developed rituals to send them away, to protect the living, to close the door. We have no such rituals for digital ghosts. So they accumulate. The past piles up without resolution, pressing against the present. Trauma is inherited not just through stories, but through constant exposure. Wars replayed endlessly, atrocities resurfacing without healing, horror consumed without digestion. The mind was not built for this. And when the mind overloads, it does what it has always done. It dissociates. This is why modern horror feels muted, why outrage burns hot and dies fast, why nothing shocks for long. The nervous system learns to numb itself as protection. Empires collapse when numbness spreads. Not because people stop caring, but because they stop believing care matters. This is the final echo of dark history, learned helplessness at scale. When peasants believed famine was God's will, they endured. When factory workers believed suffering was inevitable, they endured. When modern people believe exhaustion is normal, anxiety is personal, and collapse is abstract, they endure. Endurance is not the same as survival. And history is merciless about this distinction. The future will look back at this period and struggle to name it. They will argue over terminology, late modernity, early collapse, the digital medieval age. They will debate whether people knew what was happening. They always ask that. The answer is always the same. Some did, most felt it, few could stop it. Because systems do not fall when people see the truth. They fall when people have enough energy to act on it. And energy, real energy, mental and spiritual, is precisely what modern life drains most efficiently. So the lights stay on, the screens glow, the rituals continue. People wake, work, consume, sleep poorly, and repeat. History watches, patient as ever, not judging, just recording, and waiting to see whether this age will be remembered as a turning point or simply another chapter in humanity's long tradition of mistaking endurance for progress.
When future archaeologists dig through the remains of this era, if digging still exists, if hands still touch soil instead of simulations, they will not find altars or temples in the traditional sense. They will find devices. Rectangles of glass, fragments of circuits, batteries swollen like diseased organs, and they will struggle to understand why so many of them are worn smooth by human touch. Dark history shows us that every civilization leaves behind objects that once seemed ordinary but later feel unsettling. Shackles mistaken for tools, surgical instruments that look like torture devices, children's toys found in mass graves. Our objects will confuse them in a different way. They will find millions of identical cups, paper-thin, disposable, branded, designed to hold something hot long enough to keep the body functioning, but never long enough to encourage pause. They will not understand why the same symbol appears on them again and again, everywhere, across continents. A woman, two tails, a smile that reveals nothing. They may speculate it was a goddess, a fertility symbol, a corporate sigil. They will be wrong and right at the same time, because modern societies no longer separate the sacred from the commercial. Worship did not disappear, it rebranded. People once gathered around fires to tell stories that explained the world. Later they gathered in churches, then factories, then offices. Now they gather nowhere at all, yet remain connected constantly, bound together by invisible networks that demand attention but offer no belonging. This is unprecedented and deeply ancient. Collapse myths from the past always describe the same signs: loss of meaning, fragmentation of community, exhaustion of the population, obsession with distraction. Ancient texts describe civilizations dancing while foundations cracked, arguing over symbols while structures rotted. They did not fall because they were evil, they fell because they were tired. Our horror stories used to warn us about monsters in the dark. Today's horror is the realization that nothing is hiding. Everything is exposed, illuminated, quantified, and still unbearable. The monster is not external, it is the momentum. Momentum is terrifying because it does not care what direction it moves in, only that it continues. Systems built to grow cannot stop growing without collapsing, so they expand into sleep, into identity, into memory itself. Dark history tells us what happens when growth replaces wisdom. Forests become lumber, rivers become sewers, people become labor, labor becomes data, data becomes prediction, prediction becomes control, and control always claims it is for the greater good. People often ask whether future generations will judge us harshly. They will not.
They will pity us. They will read our records and see people drowning in information, yet starving for meaning. They will see a society capable of incredible compassion that rarely found the time to practice it. They will see warnings everywhere, scientific, psychological, historical, and wonder why they were ignored. They always wonder that. What they may not realize is how convincing the illusion was, how comfortable the cage felt, how exhaustion blurs moral clarity, how survival mode narrows imagination until alternatives feel unrealistic. Dark ages are not defined by darkness. They are defined by adaptation to darkness. And adaptation looks like normalcy. People in the future will try to locate the exact moment things turned. They will argue over dates, over events, over policies, over technologies. They will want a clean narrative. They will not find one, because collapse is not an event, it is a mood. A collective lowering of expectations, a silent agreement to tolerate what once would have been unacceptable, a silent recalibration of what it means to live well. And still, history leaves room for something else, because every dark age also produces witnesses, people who notice, people who feel the wrongness and refuse to fully numb themselves, people who preserve fragments of truth, not because they expect to save the world, but because they believe someone, someday, might need them. Monks preserved texts through centuries of chaos. Storytellers carried memory when institutions failed. Artists encoded warnings into beauty when speech was dangerous. Today, witnesses take different forms. They write, they record, they tell stories like this one, not to frighten, but to remember. Because horror is not meant to paralyze. True horror is meant to wake. And if this age is remembered at all, it will not be for its technology, or its efficiency, or its endless productivity. It will be remembered for the moment humanity stood at the edge of unprecedented power and had to decide whether it would finally learn from its own dark history or repeat it with better tools and worse consequences. The story is still being written. And the most unsettling part is this: no one knows yet which version will survive.
It always becomes intimate in the end. Dark history doesn't conclude with banners falling or cities burning. Those are only the images people remember because they are easy to film, easy to mourn. What actually ends civilizations happens quietly, inside individual lives, one after another, until the pattern is too widespread to deny. It begins when people stop planning futures and start managing days. Not dreaming, not imagining, just coping. In old journals from collapsing empires, you can see the shift. Early entries talk about hopes, fears, plans. Later entries talk about weather, food, aches in the body. The scale of thought shrinks. The world becomes smaller, heavier, closer to the ground. Modern diaries look different, but the signal is the same. Screenshots instead of handwriting, notes app confessions never meant to be read, messages typed and deleted, people thinking constantly, yet rarely deeply. Horror becomes personal when people realize they are tired, not because they failed, but because the system requires it. And that realization is dangerous. Because once you understand that exhaustion is structural, not individual, the fear changes shape.
It stops being self-directed and starts looking outward. History shows us that this is the moment power fears most. Not anger, not rebellion, but clarity. So clarity is drowned, with noise, with novelty, with endless urgency. Every era invents distractions suited to its technology: Roman games, medieval festivals, industrial entertainment. Ours is infinite, personalized, portable, inescapable. There is always something else to look at instead of what hurts. And yet, the body keeps score. Insomnia spreads, anxiety disorders rise, dissociation becomes common enough to be joked about. People speak casually about feeling unreal, disconnected, hollow. In earlier centuries, these experiences were described as spiritual crises, possession, melancholia. Now they are lifestyle conditions. Dark history teaches us that when symptoms become widespread, the cause is never individual. But modern culture resists that conclusion because acknowledging systemic harm requires responsibility, and responsibility disrupts momentum. So instead, people adapt. They lower expectations of joy. They normalize exhaustion. They accept loneliness as adulthood. They trade depth for speed. This is how horror becomes livable. And once horror is livable, it is no longer recognized as horror at all. People imagine collapse as chaos, violence, sudden loss. But history insists otherwise. Collapse is orderly at first, bureaucratic, polite. It arrives wrapped in professionalism and optimization. It feels reasonable. Until it doesn't. And by then, people are too depleted to respond. What haunts historians most is not how societies fall, but how long they linger after they should have changed, how much suffering accumulates in that liminal space between awareness and action. That space is where we live now. Not doomed, not saved, suspended. The future will likely mythologize this period. They always do. They will simplify it, assign villains, create heroes, reduce complexity to narratives that fit textbooks and documentaries. But the truth will be quieter. Most people were not villains or heroes. They were tired. They cared. They worried. They sensed something was wrong, and then they went to work, paid bills, checked messages, tried to rest, tried to stay afloat, tried not to think too much about the shape of the world, because thinking hurt and did not seem to change anything. That is the most frightening historical constant of all. Evil rarely triumphs through enthusiasm. It triumphs through fatigue. And still, this is not the end of the story, because history also records moments when exhaustion becomes unbearable, when adaptation fails, when people refuse to keep carrying a weight that was never meant to be borne alone. Those moments do not announce themselves. They do not trend. They begin in conversations, in stories, in small refusals. Someone chooses rest. Someone tells the truth without softening it. Someone disconnects long enough to remember who they were. Someone listens instead of scrolling. Someone refuses to forget. These acts seem insignificant. They always do, until later. Dark history is not just a catalog of failure. It is a record of warnings ignored and lessons rediscovered too late, and occasionally just in time. It does not predict outcomes. It reveals patterns. And the pattern says this: No system, no matter how vast, survives when enough people stop believing its demands are natural. Not overnight, not cleanly, but inevitably. So if this story feels unsettling, that is not because it is pessimistic. It is because it is unfinished. You are not listening to a tale about the past. You are inside one. And centuries from now, when someone studies the artifacts we leave behind, the devices, the records, the cups, the symbols, they will not ask whether we were advanced. They will ask whether we noticed, whether we remembered, whether in the middle of the noise and fatigue and soft-lit horror of modern life, enough people stayed awake in the right way, not alert, not productive, but aware. That is where dark history always leaves us, not with a scream, but with a choice.
Choice is the part history never records clearly. It records outcomes, dates, shifts in language, sudden changes in architecture, law, population. But the moment when a civilization could have turned and didn't, that moment is almost always invisible, smeared across decades, hidden inside ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who never thought of themselves as standing at the edge of anything. That is why the scariest chapters are written in hindsight. In the years before collapse, people still laugh. They still fall in love. They still make plans for next month, next year. Markets open. Schools function. Entertainment flourishes. From the inside, it never feels like an ending. It feels like prolongation. Dark history shows that endings feel boring while they happen. There is no music, no final warning, just repetition. The same news framed as crisis and then normalized. The same emergencies extended indefinitely. The same promises that relief is coming, soon, just not yet. People adapt to the pressure the way bodies adapt to low oxygen, by functioning badly but continuing anyway. And when adaptation becomes identity, escape feels like betrayal. This is where fear changes again. Not fear of danger, but fear of stopping. Stopping feels irresponsible, indulgent, naive. Rest is earned only after productivity, but productivity never ends. So people stay in motion even when motion hurts them, especially when it hurts them. Pain becomes proof of participation. In older societies, suffering was often given meaning, sacrifice for gods, endurance for honor, hardship for salvation. Those frameworks were brutal, but they acknowledged suffering as something imposed. Modern suffering is framed as self-chosen. If you are exhausted, you did not manage your time well enough. If you are anxious, you did not optimize your habits. If you are lonely, you did not network correctly. This reframing is one of the most effective tools power has ever developed, because it turns historical harm into personal failure, and people punish themselves far more efficiently than any external authority ever could. This is why modern horror does not need villains. There is no tyrant to overthrow, no dragon to slay. The machinery runs on incentives, not threats. Participation is rewarded just enough to keep going. Resistance is exhausting and unclear. Dark history warns us about this stage repeatedly. When systems become too complex to confront, people mythologize them. They speak of the economy, the algorithm, the system, as if these were weather patterns, inevitable, uncontrollable, impersonal. Responsibility dissolves, agency fades. And something else happens. People begin to long for simpler fear.
This is why apocalyptic fantasies flourish. Zombies, collapse scenarios, clear enemies, clear survival rules. In these fantasies, fear is direct, physical, comprehensible. The threat has a shape. The response is obvious. These stories are comforting because the real horror of modern life is not danger, it is ambiguity. Not knowing what matters, not knowing what to trust, not knowing whether effort changes anything. In previous dark ages, people prayed, now they refresh. But the underlying impulse is the same, a desperate hope that something, somewhere, is paying attention. And maybe something is. History itself has a way of watching, not consciously, not deliberately, but structurally. Patterns recur because humans recur. We forget the same lessons in new costumes. We build the same traps with better materials. But history also shows something else, quietly, almost reluctantly. That awareness spreads unevenly. Not everyone wakes up at once. Some people never do. Some wake too early and burn out. Some wake too late. But enough awareness, scattered and fragile, can still alter trajectories. Not dramatically, not heroically, incrementally. This is the part stories rarely tell because it lacks spectacle. Change begins when people start telling different stories about what is normal. When exhaustion stops being a badge of honor, when rest stops being framed as weakness, when attention becomes something to protect, not surrender, when memory becomes intentional again. Dark history survives because people forget. It ends when it ever ends because people remember. Not nostalgically, not romantically, but clearly. They remember that no system is natural, that every structure was built by choices, that what was built can be altered, slowed, dismantled, or replaced, that survival does not have to mean submission. These realizations do not spread like revolutions. They spread like whispers, from story to story, from voice to voice, from listener to listener. That is why stories like this exist, not to terrify you, but to place you gently inside a long human lineage of people who sensed the darkness before it had a name, and decided in small but meaningful ways not to let it become the only light they knew. If this were a true horror story, it would end with doom. But dark history is never that simple. It ends with uncertainty. And uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is, still contains possibility. Because as long as a story can continue, so can the choice.
Uncertainty is where history breathes. It is the space between what has already happened and what has not yet solidified into inevitability. Empires hate uncertainty. Systems fear it. Algorithms attempt to eliminate it. But humans have always lived inside it, whether they admitted it or not. What changes in dark ages is not uncertainty itself, it is how people respond to it. At first, uncertainty feels like anxiety, then it becomes background noise. Then, if it lasts long enough, it becomes doctrine. People stop asking why things feel unstable and start asking how to function inside instability. That shift marks the psychological border between a society that might still change and one that is learning to endure decay. History shows this moment repeating with eerie consistency. In the late Roman Empire, people stopped speaking of reform and started speaking of survival. In medieval Europe, communities stopped imagining justice and focused on protection. In collapsing industrial cities, workers stopped demanding dignity and settled for predictability. We are in that same corridor now. Not walking, drifting. And the drift is gentle enough that many do not notice they're moving at all.
The modern world has perfected a particular kind of darkness, one without villains, no single figure to blame, no clear enemy. Responsibility is diffused so widely it evaporates. When everyone is partially responsible, no one feels accountable. This is deeply destabilizing for the human mind. We evolved to respond to threats we could see, predators, rivals, storms, even tyrants. But a system that harms without intent, exhausts without malice, and controls without orders creates a uniquely paralyzing fear. You cannot fight fog. So people adapt again. They shrink their worlds. They focus on personal wellness while ignoring collective illness. They build private routines, private coping strategies, private philosophies. This is understandable. It is also exactly what failing systems require to persist. Fragmentation is stability's final defense. Dark history records that when shared reality fractures, solidarity weakens. People experience the same events differently, interpret the same facts through incompatible lenses, live inside personalized versions of the world. Consensus dissolves. Without consensus, coordinated change becomes almost impossible. This is not chaos. This is managed incoherence, and it is efficient. The past had propaganda. We have personalization. Instead of one narrative imposed on many, many narratives are tailored to individuals. Everyone feels informed, everyone feels justified, no one feels connected. Loneliness increases not because people are isolated physically, but because they no longer share meaning. That is the true haunt of the modern age. In older horror stories, ghosts were souls unable to rest. Today, the living are unable to settle. Minds jump constantly, pulled by alerts, demands, and anxieties that never resolve. Thought fragments, attention splinters, memory weakens. People feel hollow not because they lack experiences, but because experiences never integrate. This too is historical. Trauma researchers know that unprocessed experience accumulates. Societies, like individuals, can become traumatized. They repeat behaviors, avoid reflection, distract compulsively, react disproportionately, forget crucial lessons. A traumatized society does not heal by accelerating. It heals by stopping. And stopping is the one thing modern life makes feel impossible. So the story continues, not forward, sideways, into more complexity, more abstraction, more distance between cause and effect, until eventually people begin to sense that the problem is not any single crisis, but the constant crisis itself. This is when myths begin to form. Not ancient myths, but future ones. Stories that try to explain why people lived this way, why they tolerated it, why they accepted conditions that eroded them slowly rather than confronting them sharply. These myths will not flatter us. They will describe a species that mistook stimulation for vitality, speed for progress, endurance for strength. A species that believed it could outgrow its own limits instead of respecting them. But they will also note something else, that even in the thickest darkness, some people kept telling stories meant to slow others down, to help them notice, to reconnect patterns across centuries, to remember that history is not something that happens to humanity, it is something humanity does to itself, and can undo. This is not reassurance, it is responsibility. Dark history does not absolve, it contextualizes. It says, this has happened before, in different forms, under different names, with different tools. And each time, outcomes depended not on intelligence or technology, but on whether people could reclaim attention, rest, and meaning, before exhaustion hardened into resignation. So, if this story feels heavy, that is because it is honest. Not hopeless, honest. And honesty is where every turning point begins, even when it begins quietly in a single mind, listening late at night, realizing that the dread they feel is not personal, not random, not inevitable. It is historical. And history, unlike fate, can still be interrupted.
And in the final stretch of this long remembering, the story does not end with revelation or rebellion or collapse. It ends with recognition. Because when you trace Melusine's evolution, from whispered river spirit to carved warning on cathedral stone to sanitized emblem pressed onto a disposable cup, you begin to see the pattern repeating everywhere else. What was once feared becomes familiar. What was once sacred becomes decorative. What was once dangerous becomes convenient. Not because the danger disappeared, but because people learned how to look past it. Melusine was never destroyed. She was edited. Her curse became symmetry. Her secrecy became branding. Her scream became silence. And this is how modern horror works. Nothing is taken by force anymore. It is softened, simplified, reframed, sold. Ancient myths are not erased. They are hollowed out and worn like costumes. Symbols lose their teeth. Warnings become aesthetics. Depth becomes surface. And people drink from them every day. The past does not haunt us by returning as it was. It haunts us by returning unrecognized. That is the final cruelty of history. Not that it repeats, but that it survives unnoticed. Somewhere beneath the polished surface of modern life, the old stories are still breathing, still watching, still waiting to be remembered properly. Not as entertainment, not as nostalgia, but as mirrors. Because Melusine was never just a creature of legend. She was a story about boundaries violated, promises broken, curiosity punished, power hidden behind beauty. And those stories never go out of date. They simply change their faces. So when you hold the cup, scroll the screen, repeat the ritual, ask yourself what else has been smoothed down, softened, made harmless enough to consume. Ask yourself what used to scream. And if, somewhere in the background of your life, you feel a quiet unease you can't quite name, that is not paranoia. That is memory. Old stories do not die, they wait. And this has been another descent into forgotten history, hidden symbols, and the quiet horrors that survived by becoming normal. Welcome to NOXHOUR, where the past is never past and the darkness never really leaves. Until next time, keep watching the shadows.